Hello, so today we'll be discussing the various planning theories and models that have evolved over time to describe and evolve various cities. Right, so these theories have been evolved by sociologists, urban planners, and various people from different backgrounds to actually understand how cities function, as cities are very dynamic in nature. We'll find that there is no theory that could actually be applied 100% to a city, but there are theories that are predominantly applied to some cities. So, as far as the scope of GATE is concerned, we actually see that there are some theories that could be applied to some cities. For example, in Madrid, the concept of linear city has been applied. Then there is Copenhagen, where five-finger plan has been applied. But since cities are ever changing in nature, we find that we can't apply it to 100%, right? But as far as Gate is concerned, we see questions in the form of match the following, and so which plan is applied to which city. So we need to remember on that. So in this lecture, we'll be starting with more simplistic theories that have evolved. So these are the more early theories. Then we'll move on to more complex theories, which are very specific in nature, which have quantities or the number of people in the form of number of people that have been living or different parameters to define the theory. So firstly, we'll look at more simplistic models that were evolved in the early 20th century, right? So I'll be sharing my screen now. Okay, so this first theory is, or the model, I should say, is called the concentric zone model, or Burgess model, as it was evolved by sociologist called Ernst Burgess in 1925. And this model essentially talks about the land uses in an urban area. So he starts the model in the center, which is called the Central Business District. So when we talk about CBD or Central Business District, it is the area of a city in which all the business activity happens. So we are talking here about offices, banks, the service sector. So essentially, this is the core of the city with all the civic and economic life. And we see that the central business district, as we can see that there are many cities which are using this terminology for their business areas. So this is essentially tertiary economy. Then we find that, sorry, then we find that after the central business district, there are factories and industries. So this is essentially the secondary economy when we talk in terms of economy. So all the materials, the products are actually transported to the central business district for selling, and we see services also being sold in the central business district. So essentially, obviously, the industries are located closer to the central business district. And since the industries are located in the second ring, the working class people who are actually working in those industries are also located near the industry. So these are essentially the blue collar workers who could not afford to commute a longer distance, so they live near the industries. So we see that all these slums and more areas which are infrastructurally deficit are located in the purple as well as the light blue ring, right? So as we move further away from the concentric now, further away from the central business district, we find that more affluent people are living in the outer zones. The more of affluent people are living in the zones, since they can purchase more amount of land, they can commute more distance, since they can afford to commute more distance. So we find that middle class people are located beyond the working class housing, and then at last we see the commuter zone where suburbs are located. So here we find bungalows and duplex housings. So we see that the quality of living is essentially increasing as we move away from the central business district, so to say. Then the so this model was actually applied on the city of Chicago. So one side is actually covered by the ocean or the sea, and the other side we are applying this model. So we see that the loop one is actually the central business district. Then there are areas for the workers, and there is the industry. So we find the slums, vices, and ghetto areas here. Then we see the second immigrant settlement. So immigrants are basically the people who are moving from one place to another in search of jobs. So essentially, these are blue collar workers who are located in this area. And as we move away from the central business district, or as we move further out of town, we see more single family dwellings and more affluent areas in terms of residences. So this model was applied to the city of Chicago, but as you can see that this model is very simplistic in nature, and in reality, we don't find such demarcations in cities today. Firstly, because there is more transportation, right? There are more transportation has more transportation has evolved over time, so there is no essential way in which people would settle like this. Of course, they would want to be close to their work and they would calculate the money that they are using for commuting, but there is no demarcation in the form of concentric rings. So that is the most um, that is the disadvantage to this model. And we also find that the model is essentially very simplistic in nature. And apart from the city of Chicago, it wouldn't be applied to much places. I'm sorry. Okay. So due to the concentric city model, as a consequence of land use, the bid rent curve was also evolved. As I have been talking about the rent as well as commute in the cities, we also find that um, as we move away from the central business district, the rent for the land or the housing would be less. This is a very common phenomena as we have seen that if you're living in the central business district, the rents are high, and we see that the rent for retailing is higher than that of manufacturing, and then there is the residential. So we see that the steepest curve is of retail, then there is manufacturing and residential areas. Now, this is the von Thunen's model, which is essentially very agrarian in nature, and this was actually evolved much before the concentric zone model. But we are discussing this because this model actually is very analogous to the concentric zone model. So we can say that concentric zone model was actually inspired by this model. So we see that in the center, we have the urban center or the market. And then as we move progressively outwards, we see that there are different types of primary economic activities that have been happening. So we see after the urban center, we see intensive dairy, then we see the forest as a fuel resource, then we see cropping, and then we see ranching. Ranchings are essentially cattle rearing, and this these zones are essentially divided on the basis of how perishable the material is. So intensive farming or dairy is obviously located close to the urban market because they want to um, have less transportation distances so that they can supply these materials easily. So the dairy would get perished in 2 3 days, whereas the crops would not, right? So we have that on the basis of how perishable the goods are. So that was the Wonthonen's model. Then we have Homer Hoyt's sector model. So we saw earlier the concentric zone model and how simplistic it was in its nature, and that was the most That was the thing that it was critiqued about, right? So Homan White's model is actually more realistic. Again, it was applied to the city of Chicago, and we see that there is one central business district at the center, just like in the concentric city model. And we see that all the sectors are, all the land uses are evolved in the form of sectors. Now, these sectors exist because there are certain railroads or traffic or transportation routes. So these sectors are essentially evolved along the transportation routes, right? So we have a central business district, then then we see a zone of transition. The zone of transition essentially consists of small industries, factories, as well as there may be some workers living there, right? Then again, these industries are also located in F. This is predominantly an industrial area, and C is the lower class residential workers who want to be located near their place of work. Right now, the D zone is the middle class housing who want to be located away from the industries, and then we have E zone, which is the upper residential class housing, which are enjoying their quality of life and are totally away from the industrial areas. So this model actually addressed some of the shortcomings of the concentric city model, as it has sectors and it gives due consideration to the transportation lines that have been evolved, but it talks about just one central business district. And in cities, there could be more areas of economic and civic activities than just one. So it has its shortcomings, but it is a more evolved version of the concentric city model. So when we talk about these models in the school of gate exam, we see that these diagrams are very important. So we need to visually remember these diagrams because they can ask which model is this. So we need to remember all these diagrams. So of course, they'll not ask you to make it because that's not the scope of it, but they'll ask you to identify which model is this. So in that sense, it becomes important to visually remember this.